Hey guys, Dark Humility here. You can always catch me at twitch.tv/Dark Humility for 6 to 7 days a week of Diablo 2 action. Today, of course, we are playing PD2 Hardcore Ladder. And we've got something very special for you guys. This is our newest addition to our two-handed hardcore series, the Whirlwind Barbarian. And the Whirlwind Barbarian, let me say, is a beast. He's an S tier monstrous build that even at his max gear can even exceed the Warcry Barbarian in overall power. Of course, no two-handed hardcore series, which we started in Season 5, would be complete without the Whirlwind Barbarian. If you guys are wondering how to build a Whirlwind Barbarian on hardcore without dying, or just to keep him alive as long as possible before you move on to another character or to something else, this is the right place for you. So just to keep in mind, this is on the hardcore ladder. We will be showing off I will be explaining several softcore approaches as well, though. And of course, we'll talk about several gear options in addition to the ones we are wearing today. It is also important to keep in mind that even though I do talk about and show off many gear options, there are plenty of other gear options as well, such as like for the Warcry Barbarian, which was the last guide video we made, for instance. You could even wear budget items such as Tabex Glory, however, that's not typically optimal in any situation if you can get better gear. So there's always stuff you can wear besides what we directly mention. Of course, we also have plenty of other PD2 guides for your viewing pleasure on our YouTube here, and D2R build guides and extensive D2R written guides on maxroll.gg, so make sure to check all those out as well. Alright, so without further ado, this is Glug, the level 97 hardcore barbarian. Yes, he is my Warcry Barbarian respect as we continue on our solo 99 hardcore mapping grind. Currently rank 6 mapping solo, which is awesome. As you can see, this build is a beast. So like usual with all my guide videos, we will of course go over our stats, our skills, our gear, first the Mercenary before the gear, and then we'll be doing some LOD demos and also showing off his ability to destroy various maps of various tiers. Alright, so let's get into it. We have just enough strength to wear our gear, but what is important to mention is with the dominant Whirlwind options available to you guys, you can go more into strength if you want more damage, but if you want a combination of high attack rating and damage, then you can also put all your points into dexterity if you're playing a softcore. So dexterity and strength both equal damage if you're wearing a polearm or a spear or something of that nature. If you're not, then strength will equal damage, and so you can put more points into strength. Since we're playing hardcore though, we are prioritizing our survivability, and that is not the case. Okay, and of course next we put all of our points into vitality. This is once again a hardcore approach. On softcore, you can mix it up. You could go half damage, half vitality, or you could go pure damage if you have good enough gear and you're confident in your ability to leech and survive the vast majority of scenarios. And energy, very rarely would you ever even think of touching energy on the Barbarian, if at all, since you get very poor energy to mana ratios anyway, but it's totally irrelevant for this character because he leeches all of his mana anyway. And then of course you're going to want max res. Next up, of course, our resistances. Now as you can see, our resistances are pretty solid. We do have some res charms we can swap out if we need to boost our res more for various maps or for various things, but we have stacked res beyond what is even expected normally. As a matter of fact, just realized we are in normal, so what we can do is we can enter hell so you can see very clearly, in case you are bad at math, exactly how much res we have in hell here. And you can see we have stacked res, so we can survive conviction and negative res maps, and we won't take additional damage. Very solid hardcore approach here. In general, though, I'd make sure you have max res. With the skill natural res on the Barbarian, though, it is fairly easy to do. Alright, and then of course we have maximum damage reduction. Once again, this is a hardcore approach. In general, though, you probably should always have at least some damage reduction on your Barbarian, though, otherwise you'll probably take too much damage and die too often. That being said, though, with the crazy leeching power of Whirlwind, Whirlwind doesn't necessarily need all the defensive power in the world to survive most scenarios. It's the some scenarios that you have to worry about, which is why we have all this defensive power in the first place. Alright. And then next up, you know, there is some cast rate, which is kind of nice. You do not, in fact, need any cast rate, though. So this cast rate does help us teleport, though, using Enigma, since we are using Enigma on this build. If you are not using Enigma, this stat is totally irrelevant. But for repositioning and for quick movement around maps, FCR can help if you're using Enigma. You really don't need to worry about getting crazy FCR breakpoints with it, but decent ones are good. Faster hit recovery. It's very hard to be put into hit recovery on this build, even without a shield, because of how the ability works. However, when you're not using it, or when you're out of Whirlwind, or if it gets bugged up and you end up standing still, it is nice to have some. On hardcore, I make sure I have at least like 48 there, and it's a pretty good deal here. Attack speed is also an irrelevant stat on Whirlwind. There is attack speed, it doesn't do anything in Project Diablo 2 or Whirlwind. So in Season 6 Project Diablo 2, I think even since Season 4 maybe, or Season 5, attack speed on gear does not have any impact whatsoever on the on how fast or how many frames per action you attack with Whirlwind. With a two-handed weapon, it is 4 frames per action, and it is fixed. With two one-handed weapons, it is 5 frames per action. So, yeah, attack speed on gear does not matter. So this ability does not need attack speed, unlike almost every other melee build. I think every other melee build, period. Deadly Strike is really nice. We have nearly 50% from gear, 75% is the cap, but we also have, of course, Mastery, which will give us another effective, decent, what is effectively maybe like 10% on top of that, getting us very close to the cap there. But you can get a bit more Deadly Strike with different variations of the build. Crushing Blow does help as well against bosses, and to some small extent against most monsters. Open Wounds, once again, very helpful. Good for finishing off monsters in a lot of cases. They will just die from the open wounds, which is nice. And because of how fast Whirlwind attacks as it goes through things, it's good as well. But also not an insanely important stat. What is important, though, is that you have at least some mana leech. You don't need a ton. And life leech, honestly, you can get as much as you can possibly get here, but I think once you reach probably north of 10, this ability leeches insanely effectively. And if you're north of 20, like I am, you're going to leech insanely effectively in almost every situation. So, of course, it's very good for hardcore, because the sustain, you're either alive or dead with Whirlwind in a lot of cases, so gotta make sure you keep your life up as fast as possible. And of course, Magic Find, just a nice stat to have, not a requirement, but it will help your ability to find things in maps. No problem. So, these are the basics. Attack speed doesn't matter. What you're really looking for is damage and negative enemy physical res. That's pretty much it. And of course, a two-handed weapon will attack faster than two one-handed weapons. And Of course, one-handed weapon will not do nearly as much damage as well. I personally don't recommend going one-handed weapon at all with a shield, unless you're just starting out and maybe just farming Travancore, because it's not doing very much damage, and other barbarian abilities such as Double Throw, and of course Warcry, which is the guide we have done recently, can vastly outperform it. So it's very important here that we use either a two-handed weapon for some serious mapping, a really good two-handed weapon, or two very good one-handed weapons. Alright, so that's pretty much it for going over like stat type stuff. We'll go more into the detail into the gear in a moment. But in general, you're going to want to put 1 into increased speed. You're going to want to put 1 or more into natural resistance. If your res really sucks, you can put more points into this. Depending on what weapons you're using, you will be maxing out either polearm and spear mastery or general mastery. The best two-handed whirlwind approaches, and of course the best whirlwind approaches currently in Season 6. This can change in future seasons or in other seasons. Just like with all my build guides, you know, there's small item changes here and there, there's small power differences. There's always different things that might go on, but in general, this is to give you a general idea of what you should be doing. And, you know, even my guides back from Season 2 and beyond tend to be very relevant with some very minor tweaks as various patches come along. But anyway, in this case, we're going to max out polearm and spear mastery. Of course, that right there, iron skin, so depending on how much damage reduction you have in your gear, typically you're going to want to max this out, especially on hardcore. So you're going to want to make sure that you have as much defense as possible. So defense is a very important stat, and of course in addition to damage and everything else, and so is attack rating. But defense is going to be very key. Also, you get a % damage reduction every 2 levels. I have not maxed this out, and instead put some extra points in a shout so I can also apply it to my Mercenary, because I already have max DR without it. And one thing I forgot to mention in the stats that isn't in the stats screen is we have curse immunity, which is something I'll be talking about more when we get to the actual gear. So curse immunity means that Decrepify, lower resist, and amplify damage just don't affect our character whatsoever, which means we always have 50% damage reduction. And since that is the cap for damage reduction, period, there is literally no point in going beyond it. So that's why we kind of stopped at a certain point on Iron Skin. But it does depend on your build. I'd say most builds, especially hardcore ones, are going to want to max out Iron Skin. This one's kind of a no-brainer. You max out your Whirlwind. That is a very important source of attack rating and damage, and also increases your velocity and your movement as you use it, which is nice. Movement speed and velocity in general will affect how fast you can move with Whirlwind and pass through things. So that's another reason why you're going to want increased speed here, even though you feel like maybe you're not running around that much. That is why. Of course, almost every build should get that anyway, because it makes you run faster through town, and it really doesn't take that much. Also, even just like 1 point to combat reflexes or something makes a pretty big difference as well. Alright, so you go max Whirlwind. This is optional. I like having an extra point to leap here. You might wonder why, because I have Enigma. Well, that's because Enigma charges run out. I can traverse very long distances in maps to portals, to areas that haven't been cleared, using a combination of teleport and leap, so I like to have 1 point into here. You don't need this, though, if you're wearing Enigma. If you aren't wearing Enigma, this is pretty much mandatory. Alright. And, of course, this is where you definitely can go points into Fine Item. I have made a Whirlwind guide before that focused on farming Trav and gold finding using an Gavel of Pain. You guys might remember that guide video. So this isn't actually technically the first Whirlwind guide video. This one is part of the two-handed hardcore series, though. officially because it's actually used for mapping and everything else, and that build wasn't really equipped to handle anything except for maybe tier 1s and Trab, so it was a little bit different. But if you are focusing on Trav, definitely make sure you get some points in a fine item or use a Heart Carver or a combination of, Heart Carver and Alibaba on swap or something, and then do that. If not, you leave this blank. Since we are pounding our way through maps going to 99, we're not going to worry about that one. Alright, and then of course, you're going to want this one right here. So you're also going to want to max out Battle Command. Battle Command is straight damage. It's also 3 skills if you max it out. Very good stuff. It's very hard to get damage straight up on your skills. Battle Command, Whirlwind though, and Polearm and Spear Mastery in our case is pretty much the lion's share of just all the damage. At this point, you can put points into all kinds of things depending on if you're hardcore or softcore or your exact build. I like 1 point to Grimward because we can use it right before we kill a boss, and we can greatly increase our damage against a lot of map bosses and things of this nature, mine and my mercenaries, so that's kind of nice. The 1 point to Battlecry is kind of a no-brainer. That one is because casting this on really physical resistant or physical immune monsters can help you kill them a lot easier, and of course it helps you kill bosses as well. Of course, as you can see, if I do my swap to my grandfather's, I can actually get a huge Battlecry debuff here, so to deal with some very troublesome enemies, it's very possible to get a very high buff for this. If you want to buff it up even more, you can put additional points into Battlecry, which I think is even easier to justify on Softcore when you're not looking for even more damage. But instead, where we put most of our rest of our points is in a Shout, so we can get additional defense. As I said, defense is important. This also helped the Mercenary a bit, since I maxed out my 50 DR by putting 14 points into Iron Skin. I put some more into Shout. And then, of course, I put the rest into Battle Orders. Now, you could just ignore Shout at this point as well and just max out Battle Orders as well. At any rate, Battle Orders, of course, very important for life. See, we have 3,500 life here on Hardcore. That's definitely a hardcore amount of life. You can even survive very effectively on Hardcore even with amounts as low as 2,800. But this is an ultra safe build that's meant to deal with some of the toughest maps, some of the toughest, most dangerous situations, auras, and all kinds of things, fire towers and marketplace. We're meant to just tank a lot of damage. And so this build allows us to do pretty much all of that very effectively. Alright, and so Mercenary is the same as the Whirlwind Barbarian. It is a Defiance or a Mercenary, giving us a lot of extra defense and giving us 11% DR with maxed out Battle Command. So, very effective stuff there for rounding out our build. And of course, that makes him really tanky and effective as well. Alright, let's talk about his gear a bit. So, these are the 2 items that are really the crux of a late game Whirlwind Barbarian Mercenary. If you don't have these items, you might want to even consider running an Act 5 Mercenary that has its own Might Aura, or using the Whirlwind Barbarian that casts Battle Cry as well. But since you have Battle Orders on yourself, you probably don't want the Whirlwind Mercenary that casts it for you because you just don't need it because you're a Barbarian. So you can use the Might Aura Bash Mercenary from Act 5 if you are too poor to afford some of this stuff. But if you can, you get that Defiance Aura on top of level 8 Might Aura from Templar's Might. Yes, some of these items are unslammed. At some point they will be. There's definitely some upgrades, just like with the Warcry Barb that we can get to this build, but we'll talk about that more as we go through the items. But in general, an 8 Might Templar's Might is best in slot. And we also got lucky enough to roll a 20 Concentration or a Pride this season in an Thresher. giving us a max level concentration aura as well. With both of these auras, we get a ton of damage and attack rating. And in general, they're just really, really powerful. And it also makes the Mercenary do quite a bit of damage too, so if you telestomp with Enigma, it will hurt quite a bit. So these are indeed best in slot. Now you might ask, why not Fanaticism? Once again, Fanaticism improves attack speed. And you don't need attack speed at all on this build. Another thing about Fanaticism, of course, is that you can get it on an Act 1 Mercenary, which could be nice in some ways because of the Vigor aura, but the level of the aura itself is lower, so you're just not going to have as much damage using that. Also, she's very squishy, and since you jump into the middle of the monsters, even with really tanked up gear, she will probably die quite often. And so there's a bit of a problem with that too, whereas this Mercenary leeches way more effectively. So that is definitely, I always go into more detail in these more comprehensive guide type things, so I like to, talk about various aspects of why the build works the way it does. This was also used on the Warcry Mercenary, you might remember this. It's just Life Leech, DR, and MDR, and attack speed. We're actually hitting the 75 attack speed breakpoint for Giant Thresher using these 3 items. So we're hitting 80% attack speed, 80 attack speed, which hits the 75 breakpoint for a Giant Thresher. Giant Thresher is just as fast as a Thresher. People always ask me, why should I get a certain base over another? And really what it comes down to is how much attack speed you're going to be able to put on your Mercenary while also giving him enough damage reduction, attack speed, and any other stats such as auras that you need to give him. And resistances, of course, as well. See, this Mercenary has got pretty stacked resistances, as he should. And, or at least maximum res, you want to make sure he at the very least has maximum res. But yeah, at any rate, he's got solid DR, he's got the attack speed breakpoint, he's got Life Leech, he's got a lot of Life Leech, he has increased attack speed, he even has some open wounds, which is nice to apply to bosses and things of that nature, and even has some strength, which is really, really, really cool. So at any rate, he is all in, 110%. As a matter of fact, I think... Actually, I think he would need to level 1 more time, and then we can take the Hell Rune out. Yeah. Because then he'd have exactly 222 strength without this in here, but I think currently he has 221 and he can't wear it. Just because his 30 attack speed Drax is lacking 1 strength. That's very interesting. So as you can see, there's definitely some optimizations. I only puzzle box this Templar, so yeah, it's good stuff though. We also have attack speed here with PDR. He was getting attack speed and also getting some physical damage reductions, so that was really nice. We needed exactly 75 attack speed. And then of course, but as you can see, you can get 3 socketed gazes, you can get Crown of Ages, you can use like Laying of Hands here, and then Nosferatu's Coil. There's definitely a lot of different combinations. And then Merman's Sprocket is because you whirl very quickly and you leave the Mercenary behind. This helps the Mercenary keep up a little bit. It's not necessarily necessary to have this. You can give him like a damage boot like Gore Riders as well. There's definitely a lot of other things you can do, but the huge amount of faster run walk is actually quite useful. Okay. So, it's like someone wanted to trade, but I started the video, so we'll have to do it afterwards. Alright, so that's the Mercenary, and that's kind of what you want to do in general. You want damage auras, and as many as you can get. Fanaticism isn't as useful because you're literally wasting one of the best components of Fanaticism, so that's why you don't use that on the Whirlwind Barbarian. Alright, let's go into the actual meat of the build, the gear, and kind of talk about what the overall goal is with the gear. So the overall goal of the Whirlwind Barbarian's gear is to give you a lot of damage stats. So you want really high Deadly Strike, Crushing Blow if you can get it. You want negative enemy phys res. In our case, that's coming from the Amplify Damage on striking, and Whirlwind procs all on strikings on PD2. This is not the case in D2R. So they made it to where Whirlwind can proc anything that is on striking, which is really cool. And Amplify Damage is the best source of negative enemy physical res you can possibly get on the weapon. That is a very, of course, good choice. You're also looking on hardcore for, combined with Iron Skin and your Mercenary and your gear, you're looking to hit 50% damage reduction, which we are. As a matter of fact, I'd say our DR is even a bit overkill, but because we could have just maxed out Iron Skin, we have a bit too much maybe here and whatnot, but those items still accomplish what they need to. We're also looking for Curse Immunity. Now, Curse Immunity, I would say, is the biggest key to consistently surviving in hardcore. Most situations, you don't need Curse Immunity. However, every once in a while, maybe Whirlwind might bug out a little bit. You'll stop Whirlwinding slightly. It won't hit things. And you'll find yourself in the middle of, Lancers and Archers with double aura, and then you might die because you're Amplify damaged. In the case of having Curse Immunity, not being amped means you always have max DR unless the map itself lowers your DR. So, in this case, it is indeed very much the case that you should, on hardcore, invest in Curse Immunity. You also want high defense, something else we talked about. Curse Immunity, high defense, and maximum DR, combined with really high leech and a lot of damage, Amplify Damage too, so a lot of negative physical res, will make this build shred, and it'll also make it insanely difficult for monsters to even lower your health at all. I have seen some situations with this build where they are successful in lowering your health, but it's very extreme situations. Multiple damage auras and very powerful enemies. But even then, it can't quite break my health globe, and that is why we have all of this defensive power, to make sure that a two-handed, non-shield, non-block barbarian is capable of surviving even the toughest situations. And so, with that, the two best pieces of gear in Season 6 for Whirlwind are Reaper's Toll and Steel Pillar. A max or a very high rolled steel pillar with 5 or 6 sockets and ethereal steel pillar can beat out the weapon I currently have, but such things on hardcore are almost non-existent, if not completely non-existent. They are very, very difficult to get. Steel pillar, of course, getting a lot of negative phys res and getting more top-end damage than the Reaper's Toll. But the main things with the Reaper's Toll is the Reaper's Toll has ignored target defense, which Steel Pillar does not have. It also has Deadly Strike, which Steel Pillar does not have. And of course, on top of that, it also has a lot of damage. It has Leech built into it, so you don't need Leech elsewhere. And it has Amplify Damage, which allows you to more easily break immunities in combination with Battle Cry. And of course, this will automatically break a lot of physical immunities, whereas you are forced to cast Battle Cry with the Steel Pillar approach unless you're also using Atmas. Of course, that would possibly make your Deadly Strike count extremely low though. So overall, F Reaper's Toll is indeed one of the very best options for this build, period. And of course, you put in a lot of ED, enhanced damage, minimum and maximum damage jewels in this. This is a 276 ED base. I think it's 272 base ED. Ethereal Reaper's Toll, corrupted for 5 sockets. So it's definitely one of the best weapons probably in existence on the hardcore ladder for this currently. But I know that there's plenty of other weapons out there, including a 6-socketed Steel Pillar that will exceed this. Once again, if you get a really, really good Steel Pillar, which are maybe a bit more common on softcore, you can definitely beat out a Reaper's Toll in most situations. Heavy physical res or immunity maps, maybe not, but everywhere else it will do more damage. as long as you can, use different gear. Since we have a lot of Deadly Strike here and here, we don't even use High Lords here. Instead, we use Saracens. We get a whole ton of enhanced damage here on the Saracens, and we also get all resistances as well. So Saracens is really good, but if you're using Steel Pillar, you're going to want to use High Lords most likely to make sure your Deadly Strike is as high as possible. Of course, if you're suffering in the res department still, you could also use Metal Grid. All three of those amulets. Metal Grid is very good for boss killing as well, like Uber killing, so that's another thing you can use in the amulet. So in terms of armors, there's really 3 armors that really come to mind for this build. There's more armors you could do, of course, such as a lot of safety crafts where you can get really high damage reduction on top of having enhanced damage, which is very tough to craft, but you can do it. But Fortitude is probably the cheapest option, but it will give you actually more damage than the damage we're going to be showing off here today. I actually did test it, and the damage did feel a little stronger, but it did feel like it wasn't too significant, and then I didn't have any magic find, and I had way more life with this option as well. I had faster run walk, which made the Whirlwind feel better. And of course, the teleporting is just really indispensable. So Enigma, believe it or not, is insanely good on a Whirlwind Barbarian. Fortitude, of course, is very, very solid. Stone will keep you alive. There's definitely some other options that come to mind besides the 3 main ones, which are Enigma, Fortitude, and Tyrael's Might. Tyrael's Might has more faster run walk and also has damage against demons and undead. And so that's really good too. And Tyrael's Might, of course, has a lot of other very nice defensive stats. But then there's also the PDR ED armors, there's Stone, there's some other things that work really well too. There's Lionheart, so that's a very cheap option when you're like trying to farm LOD content. There's a lot of other budget options. And remember, if I don't mention an option, it doesn't mean that it's not a good option. It just means that, there's so many items in PD2 that work in different situations, and just try them out. If it's like an item like Tabek's Glory when it comes to the Warcry Barbarian, that item gives faster cast rate and block. That's very useful. Might not be ideal though, because you have no plus skills on it or damage reduction, but it is something that can work in a lot of situations. All right, so the Helm's an interesting one. So for hardcore, I think hands down, there's nothing better in hardcore than a Crown of Ages. 15 DR, of course, 3 sockets is really, really, really good. It's a really, really solid option here. So this is just filled with more ED damage jewels of various kinds, also a res jewel giving us more fire resistance, which is really nice. Especially when we're trying to stack more fire resistance as well for the fire towers and whatnot inside of inside of Marketplace and whatnot. So we do Marketplace sometimes with this build quite a bit because it's a very high experience map, and we want to make sure we stack fire so we don't get insta-gived by fire towers of conviction or similar problems. But of course, the curse duration reduction, once again, being curse immune on hardcore while also getting huge damage values is pretty key. And so this helm is just, it does it all. It also gives you hit recovery and pretty much everything you could possibly want. On Softcore, Veil of Steel will get you the highest amount of enhanced damage you can want as well, and it also gives you a ton of res. So Veil of Steel is another extremely good option. And if you happen to be extremely rich or fortunate, or somehow come upon this item, which is practically non-existent on hardcore, maybe it's been existent a few times in the last 6 seasons. However, I don't know of one currently on hardcore. There might be one out there somewhere. But on if you do happen to find it, the Overlord's Helm. Overlord's Helm has a lot of negative phys res, and it's pretty crazy strong to use on softcore. And even on hardcore, you can use it if you get your curse immunity elsewhere, or if you just make sure you overstack your damage reduction throughout the rest of your gear. So There's definitely other options as well, and yeah, the negative fizz res from Overlord's Home is kind of insane, so that's also a good option. It's kind of like how I neglected to mention on the Whirlwind Barbarian, you could use Ethereal's Path for FCR on boots, but you know, there's one of those currently existent on the Season 6 hardcore ladder, but I slammed it. You should check out that video as well, but that's another item that I don't think many people regularly encounter, so I typically don't really mention them. But, you know, it is always fun to note that there are some options out there that are crazy. Another thing to note is that if you can get your negative fizz res, if you can get your fizz res or amplify damage elsewhere, you can use some other gear options as well. So Atma's Scarab works pretty well with a lot of gear combinations. To increase your chance of casting Amplify Damage. It can be really good with things like an Ethereal Cranium Basher, which is another very good weapon option that also casts Amplify. Doesn't have nearly as high of a chance to do it, so it's not nearly as consistent, but you can use it. You can also use like Atma's Scarab in combination with 2 Stone Crushers. Since they attack 1 frame slower though, it's arguable that 2 Stone Crushers can never be as strong as a single 2-handed weapon at this point, but that could change in the future or be slightly modified. So Stone Crushers are also not quite what they used to be, but 2 Stone Crushers and an Atmas for Amp is also a very solid approach as well. Or 2 Stone Crushers and a High Lords, and you get the negative fizz res off of your weapons as well, kind of like with a Steel Pillar. And so there's a lot of different things you can do. I consider Gore Rider's best in slot, period. I mean, it's going to give you all the stats you're going to want. Damage stats, just the best at doing that, period. This also has just more MF, but there's all kinds of slams, of course, you could use on it, like PDR and other stuff that you could be lacking on the rest of your build. And, yeah, now against certain Uber bosses, it might actually be preferable to use something like Goblin Toes, so yeah, it just kind of depends. It depends if you got your open wounds elsewhere as well, and so that is very, very important to note. So Gore Riders is good. There, you could also use War Travelers, which will give you some more flat damage, which isn't terrible if you want to hit really high MF values as well. This is part of the Curse Immunity approach. Once again, Curse Immunity approach, I'd say, is overkill for the vast majority of situations. However, there's so many situations and maps that are just pure nasty, and sometimes you really want that Curse Immunity. Also, so you don't get sniped before you run into Whirlwind, or you don't get blindsided. You know, you want to make sure you're not cursed. And on hardcore, that really, really is important. So with this, we get more curse duration reduction, and we get 20 FCR for casting Enigma. If we didn't have this, the Enigma teleport speed would be really slow, and arguably Leap would be faster. So then at that point, you'd probably rather just use Leap and just use Fortitude. But if you have Enigma, I 100% recommend you just go with the Cultist. Also, the Blind's target doesn't counter the amp. The amp will go on top of it, and you'll have both blind and amp working simultaneously, so it's actually very useful as well in terms of the survivability gloves. Attack speed gloves, remember, aren't useful. However, you can also use gloves like Steel Rend. Steel Rend is nice, has a lot of enhanced damage, and has other very important stats as well that deal with damage and everything else. Of course, I'm also getting some extra res on this, but you can get life, MF, whatever else you want. The remainder of our curse duration reduction, since these give us 80, is coming from our belt and our ring. Of course, if you don't have Mana Leech Corruption elsewhere, this is a pretty nice Mana Leech ring. I corrupted for curse duration, and it also gives us attack rating, which you definitely want some attack rating if you can on this build. I feel like we're actually kind of lacking it a little bit, but Whirlwind and our auras kind of do the trick for us, so we're okay. Definitely okay there. And then, of course, we have curse duration reduction here, damage reduction, and more life leech. Once again, life leech is pretty huge. And we have magic damage reduction. The flat MDR keeping us alive in a lot of those situations involving lightning enchanted as well. And we even have Lightning Absorb with the Wisp Projector. Wisp Projector is typically best in slot just to have one of these because of the Heart of the Wolverine, which gives you quite a bit of extra ED and attack rating. Of course, it also gives you a plus skill. Raven Frost's are really good. BK Set Rings, BK Death Band is also very good on this build. If you want to survive intense fire situations, Dwarf Stars can be good. There's definitely a lot of things that can be a good melee rings, like this ring with single leeches or dual leeches with all res and AR and things like that are always going to be really good as well. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here with regarding this build. One thing I do want to mention, a couple of other cheap options as well. I mean, there's definitely, once again, so many other cheap options that you can run. Soul Drainers, of course, is another very good option for negative Fizz Res, and if you're using Fortitude, you probably just want to go with that. And if you're not running Curse Immunity because you're on Softcore and you can die once and it's okay, Soul Drainers will further reduce negative Fizz Res and will further increase your damage. So once again, this kind of takes all those things into account on hardcore, so you want to survive and crush everything simultaneously. But, you know, Gavel of Pains with multiple sockets, Cranium Bashers are going to be very good besides these two. Some cheap weapons are things like Oaths, Two-Handed Oaths, and Ethereal Edge. The weapon Ethereal Edge is particularly good at killing Travancore. So that's a lot of good stuff. Definitely a lot of stuff there for sure. You can go full Immortal Kings as well. Let's not forget about that, considering you also have a Maul in the Immortal Kings set, and it's best suited for Whirlwind. So you can wear full Immortal Kings, and that's probably the cheapest way to Whirlwind and crush things. And it, for the most part, it'll even be safe, even doing some tier 1 maps and all the LOD content, no problem. This build is built for, well, max tech and everything. You know how it is. Gotta smash the whole game. Having a trusty demon limb isn't bad if you want some extra AR, maybe to do some damage types like fire that you don't have in the rest of your build. And for the most part, you know, any melee build kind of like this, you know, there's some melee builds that benefit more from plus skills, but this is definitely one of those max AR life situation builds. The skill Whirlwind itself doesn't get a huge boost from plus skills. Very small gains every skill to begin with. So really what you want to do, you want to make sure you get maximum. We're hitting that, getting that FHR here and here as well. And we're even using some life all res small terms. You can use max AR MF, max AR life, life, AR, res, max damage, FHR. Those are kind of all your best friends on this particular build, depending on if you're doing Ubers or regular content. Since it's just a mapping guide, you know, we'll go over the mapping, of course, and we'll demo that specifically. You also have that Geed's Fortune, so you can boost that MF. It's kind of hard to get MF on this build. You usually got to rely on like Magic Find Corruptions, you know, Magic Find on a Wisp, on this ring, on other corruptions. I mean, that's kind of how it is. But luckily, when we enter a map, we're typically around 200 to 300 plus, depending on the degree of the map. That's a max damage large charm right there. It's pretty cool. Then we also got a really high B Torch and an Anium. So that's what you want in general. You can even corrupt the Annie if you want him. And then on your offhands, you're going to use ideally 2 Grandfathers, or pre-buff Battle Orders, Battle Command, and Shout. And of course, you can even use it to pre-buff Find Item if you want to put a point to Find Item to some extent. Of course, if you're not rich enough to afford these, you can just use 3 Warcry Spears you can buy from Mala very early on in the game, or you can use Hodos. Hodos are also very solid. So you can get +3 skills either way, and then you're maxed out for buffs. Wow, that was a lot. And the reason that was a lot is pretty simple. This character has a lot of gear options, and there's a lot of complicated stuff. But in general, proccing that Amplify Damage, getting that negative Fizz Res, is very, very good at getting really high damage and leeches of both kinds. It's good at getting some DR if you're on softcore, but if you're on hardcore, you want to go max DR if possible, with your skills combined with your gear, and you want curse immunity. Curse immunity is pretty key, and high defense. Alright, so without further ado, we're going to show him off in a couple of LOD areas, just to show you guys what he is capable of. One thing to know is there's plenty of other things you can also use, like T-Gods against Uber Mephisto and against Souls. There's plenty of other gear options I didn't even mention. You can also use Dungos if you have enough life leech elsewhere. But as you can see, normal Travancore is kind of a joke to him. He just... Wow, those are actually kind of nice. Both of those are. Just goes to show you how ridiculous Travancore is, right? Travancore's kind of nuts. Alright, so Travancore, no problem, as you can see there. We'll also be doing Chaos, and then that'll be it for the LOD demos, because this character is way, way too strong. But as you can see, we just teleport into the pack, and then we hold down the Whirlwind button. We prioritize high-value targets. Short whirlwinds will allow us to do more damage to targets in front of us and are better against targets with more life. But for a lot of types of enemies, we can just kind of plow through them. And we can go a bit faster with whirlwind. Shorter whirlwinds give you more control. If you're up against dangerous range enemies, you might want to teleport directly on top of them if you have Enigma. Or if you have some kind of teleport charge, and then swipe them out with Whirlwind. Also, just now, it looks like we just found a Cranium Basher. What the heck? What is this thing? Oh, it's an Earth Shifter. Wow. That's kind of cool, I'm not gonna lie. Really rare item just to find in a random ass demo here. One thing to note is that one thing you gotta be careful of, especially on hardcore, is enemies you can't leech through. So there's a lot of enemies like skeletons particularly. Those are the ones that really come to mind. Also things like fire towers that you can't leech through. You gotta be very careful. Make sure you crush them and leech off of other things around them. Or you kill them as fast as possible and start leeching off of other things ASAP, or in the case of fire towers, make sure you don't go too deep and stay on the outside. And even get your Mercenary out in front. It's just one of the reasons why I really like Enigma, because you can really take advantage of that there. Wow, we're getting some nice items just farming one chaos here. So as you can see here, this character is absurdly strong. He doesn't even flinch at any normal content. And this is definitely overkill for that. Like I said, things like oaths and ethereal edges, basic crafted weapons, technically the best weapon you could get is like a ultra high damage, like ethereal crafted thunderball or something of that nature. Now remember, we can swap to our two grandfathers here, cast a really high battle cry 24 on the boss, and then just start whirling through him, and the amp will automatically apply from the Reapers, or if you have amps somewhere else. One thing to note is, of course, if you don't have amp anywhere else, and you don't have auras, that might aura from the Act 5 Mercenary, and something like maybe a Gavel or a Vile Husk or something can be used to proc amp from the Merc as well. So you can have like one aura on the Merc, and you can have amp, and then you can just have a weapon that is somewhat effective on the main body of gear. But of course, once you get this level of gear, you know, we're definitely not concerned with that any longer. Alright, so that's pretty easy stuff, right? I mean, that's no problem. And with the lightning sword, if we also use T-Gods, you know, be pretty simple stuff just to go through as well. I actually want to curse immune T-Gods, so it can run some other types of maps, like maps with souls and other things. Of course, remember, if you want to prepare for Conviction Aura on souls or fire towers, you're going to want to make sure you stack your res about 80, 85, even 90 higher than the caps that you currently have here. Alright, so it is now time to do some very basic map demos. We're not going to do anything too crazy. I'm not even going to corrupt them here. But suffice it to say that getting really high density on this character is pretty crazy. If you get enough damage, you can even do fortified very effectively. However, without the density, you can argue whether or not that's actually more efficient. I don't personally think so. I think I'd rather just go for really ultra high density instead of fortified. But if you do fortified with a really high density map, the density cut in half is still pretty substantial. So there's definitely something to be said for it. I personally think that this build thrives a bit more off of just cutting through tons and tons of monsters as fast as possible, instead of having to use your mobility quite a bit. So this is indeed, I don't know, try it both ways. Either way, it doesn't seem to matter, but this map here has some maximum life, but as you'll see very shortly here, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. So this is one of his best tier 1 maps. He's good at any map without native physical immunes, so as long as there aren't physical immunes in the map itself, my loot filter will tell you if there's immune to physicals on the map itself, so just don't do those maps. The Reaper's Toll approach is a bit more effective against monsters with stone skin that can get physical immune though, because I can proc amp insanely reliably, on top of also getting Battle Cry. See, I can also cast Battle Cry whenever I want and further increase my damage. Alright. So as you can see, he's it's just gangbusters, really. In tier 1 map, you know, you pretty much one-shot, you know, you can one-shot a lot of monsters through like one pass. Especially if they have no maximum life, it's pretty easy to do, even all the way up through tier 3 maps. To a pretty large extent here. And as you can see, being able to teleport, reposition the Mercenary. You can see though, the Mercenary is pretty fast though because of the Merman sprockets though, so he's keeping up pretty good. But you know, he doesn't keep up perfectly, and getting him right into the fray is good for his survivability as well. Sometimes he'll die if he lingers behind, especially if he doesn't have 100% max DR. Like, let's see here, what's his current DR? Mercenary has 33% damage reduction. Of course, we can also use this, like I said, if you want to cast Enchant for a bit more fun there. Swap to our grandfathers, cast Battle Cry, cast Amp, do some short whirlwinds, and bam, that's it. It's the most effective way to kill something like a boss, and bingo. As you can see here though, this character has no problems whatsoever. Lower HP monsters getting one shot, no problem. And proccing very reliably, so Reapers is indeed one of the best in-game weapons, but like I said, there's plenty of good options. I would say Reapers or Steel Pillar are the best possible weapons, with Steel Pillar, a really good Steel Pillar, most of the time probably beating out Reapers, but it does depend on your item combo once again. With Reapers, you don't really need to rely on attack rating except for bosses and elites, which is really good. You don't need as much Deadly Strike elsewhere, so you can get more stats like Res elsewhere, and you can still have really high Deadly Strike. So even though my sheet damage might look a little low compared to sheet damage you can get on a lot of weapons, because my Deadly Strike is effectively almost maxed between the crit strike on my Mastery and on my gear, my actual damage is actually insanely high. And it just looks really good in general. But this is what an S tier build looks like. It just plows through a map. Certain maps it has similar speed to a topped out Warcry Barb, a little bit less speed, and then some of them are just better. I would say any maps with Decrepify but no physical immunes, this one does better. Maps with any kind of physical immunes at all, Warcry can better deal with because of the higher level battle cry. And the more reliable amp from Reapers on the Mercenary directly. Of course, the reliability is pretty similar with Reapers on Whirlwind, but it's really the battle cry, being a higher level. But as you can see, you know, you can do shorter Whirlwinds, you know, if there's like a boss to kill. Shorter Whirlwinds does give you more control. And if you're not confident you're going to totally one-shot the monsters, it's really good for just plowing through stuff in general. So there's a tier 1 there. We're not going to go all the way through it, but I think you guys get the idea.
Good to see you.
And you can also see that, did our health pretty much drop even once? No, it didn't. And we didn't have to suffer from any of the decrep. We didn't have to suffer from lower res, from a possible horizon. We didn't have to suffer from all kinds of things. Not being cursed is quite a blessing. This is like the first curse immune character I've built on hardcore, which I know is kind of strange for a hardcore player because typically curse immune is like something a lot of hardcore builds shoot for. I've never really found it 100% necessary on builds with like energy shield or summons, even with two-handed builds like, you know, the sorceress at energy shield, druid with summons, you know, it never really felt necessary to me. It just felt like an extra stat you didn't need, and you know, I never died with those builds. But what's interesting though is on this build it's a bit different because you only have your mercenary, so it's only you. You gotta make sure you're able to survive every situation and just be able to tank it straight to the face. Alright, so let's go show off a nice tier 2. Fall of Chaldeum is great. In general, maps that are narrow passageway maps, you know, river, horizon, Chaldeum, not super wide open areas tend to be a bit better for this build. Wider open areas tend to be a bit better for the Warcry Barbarian, so that's kind of another difference between these two builds. They definitely have very similar speeds and strength overall, but you know, it depends on the map and it depends on the area. This build's definitely way stronger in any map with Decrepify, like Canyon, River, and Horizon. And Warcry Barbarian is quite a bit better in maps with physical immunes like Bastion, and wider open maps such as Ashen Plains. Or wider open maps such as Blood Moon. This character is pretty solid in Blood Moon, but Warcry Barbarian absolutely flattens the cow, so it's a little, you know, there's definitely some notable differences here. So we are level 97, so we're not gonna see a lot of progress on the experience bar here at the moment. Especially that now that we're in tier 1, tier 2 maps. But yeah. Two-handed hardcore has to have the Whirlwind Barbarian. You know, I've done a lot of two-handed hardcore build guides. Where I used a two-handed build in hardcore. And it's very cool to show off. Probably one of the most quintessential two-handed hardcore builds, which is the Whirlwind Barbarian. What's interesting is even with all the defensive power we have, there's still no guarantee we survive absolutely everything. It's, you know, you just don't have a shield, so sometimes you can just take way more damage. The Mercenary dies, for instance, and then all of a sudden you're left alone with multiple auras. You can still die. I'd say since my fire res isn't 100% stat against fire towers, that is a bit concerning with Conviction Aura. We have some charms we can swap out for that though, so there's a lot of situations you can 100% deal with, but as you can see though, this build doesn't suffer from anything. And remember, you can always cast that battle cry if the monsters very physical resistant, blah blah blah. Oh, I forgot to cast my Heart of the Wolverine. Bad streamer, bad content creator. Okay. I do typically forget that. And that is a very common thing for me to forget. Quite tragic, I would say. Quite tragic. Alright. But you can see, though, you know, how much health we have, though, and how much leech, just having all our DR and being curse immune, it's going to be really tough for the monsters to kill us. And like I said, most of the time this is all overkill. You wouldn't even have to be curse immune most of the time on hardcore. But there are situations where if you're cursed, you can definitely die. Remember, you can't leech through every monster type, so sometimes you pass through monsters that you can't leech through. And they just have all these damage auras and they kill you, so it happens to a lot of people. Also, if you're going to want to go two-handed hardcore in group maps, this is probably the only way to do it while staying alive. Very important to mention group mapping. I mean, I am focusing more on solo mapping this season, but you can see how... Alright, so this is... Oh, he stunned me up. That's annoying. So get that Grimoire down, get that really strong battle cry, and then, bam, he's dead. Couple of short whirlwinds and toast. Really easy stuff, right?
Good day.
Okay, and then finally, let's show off, in my opinion, his best tier 3. Which is River of Blood. River of Blood is just a really solid map in general. But River of Blood does have those archers you can't leech because they are undead bones. Bones, you can't leech the bones, just remember that. And of course, also things like towers, things that are not flesh and blood, you're not going to be able to leech those. Just be aware of what you can't leech through and make sure you're leeching ASAP, or you're doing very short whirlwinds. Now, something I didn't mention explicitly in this guide video yet, but something I probably should mention at some point in here, is that in the middle of a whirlwind, you can't do or complete any other actions. That includes using potions, using feeding your mercenary a potion with shift. No.
Thanks.
Like shift 2, right? That right there. No, you can't. No, you can't feed your mercenary nothing. You can't feed yourself anything. So timing is very important. You always want to make sure you're 100% healthy before starting a whirlwind. And of course, make sure you don't do ultra long whirlwinds, as those tend to bug out a bit more. They're harder to control. And if you whirlwind a bit too long, you can find yourself whirling through things that you just can't survive. So make sure you're targeting with your teleport if you have it. Make sure that you're whirlwinding smart and you're focusing on monsters that could kill you. Maybe even focusing down the ones you can't leech first so that you can make sure you can survive them by the time you get there. So it's all kind of good stuff just in general. But I mean, you can see a build like this is definitely built to survive all kinds of crazy stuff. Alright, so let's go into a River of Blood here. Very basic one once again. Just gonna show off kind of what he does. I guess I could even use the enchant from Demon Limb, but I'm not even gonna bother just to show you don't need it. See if we could find a good Fizz immune monster. See, sometimes these flesh spawners here are Fizz immune. They can be very nice. So, once again, very narrow passage area, tier 3. This map is the OG map. It is the Season 1 tier 3, the only one that existed in Season 1. And overall, it is solid stuff. Very, very solid stuff. At any rate, you can see most of the time, we're good. And if we get that amp proc on the monsters, they die pretty much instantly. You see that monster was both blinded and had amp on it. So there's some archers. If you're concerned about the archers or if they have certain auras and things of that nature. By the way, you should always stick to one side of blood here. I got distracted though, so I went around. You can always teleport on top of them. See, there's archers here. I just teleported directly on top of them. Didn't give them a chance to do anything. And you can see there's my aura over here. Now there's no archers over here, but if there was, what I could do is I could just teleport, kill the archers first, or just focus on killing the damage aura first. Now you might be wondering why bother with that nonsense, and I'm like, well, because it can be quite good. Now, the Mercenary's got plenty of leech and things like that, and he's got some faster room walking stuff to keep up, but sometimes he dies, so sometimes it's actually very useful to make sure you kill the very high damage monsters so the Mercenary just doesn't get gibbed. Sometimes it's not about you, it's about the mercenaries, or sometimes it's about someone else you're trying to protect behind you. See, having Enigma is really nice, just really nice in general. I mean, this is a 200 density map, but you still find yourself having to reposition quite often. You could just teleport right on top of these very fast monsters here. Give them a nice shred. And that will be that. Look at that. Look at him. Just teleport directly on top of the archer packs. That's always my advice here. Just kill them first. So there you go. I swapped weapons, casted ultra strong battle cry, and then he dies in like 2 seconds. It's also the advantage of having 2 grandfathers is that level battle of the battle cry is also insanely high. Of course, if you're getting hit a lot though, I don't recommend doing that. I recommend just killing them. Casting battle cry in your main hand and just killing them ASAP if they're physical immune. Otherwise you might take a lot of damage from ranged enemies and monsters approaching you very quickly. So be very careful of that. And of course there's buff timers since Season 5 on PD2. They are a godsend. Make sure to mine them and make sure you keep up your buffs. One thing I should say is that it's very noticeable when you don't have your shout, when you don't have your battle orders, and you don't have your battle command. You lose damage, you lose your defense, and you will start taking much more damage from very strong enemies. So if you lose those buffs, that's definitely a way you could die on this build. And it's not good. I've seen it firsthand. I forgot the buffs, and on Canyon of Cheshire there's like a ton of concentration might soul flares, and I almost died whirling through them. I went like through them a little bit. Gotta be very careful. As you can see, most of the time, he's a beast. Velocity maps are fun because you can go even faster. As you can see, the only real maps I'm getting experience are in tier 3s. I'm actually getting significant experience in this map compared to the other 2, you might notice. Yeah, it's a... Yeah, see, this is one of those situations right here. I'd be very careful about. And you might notice here, we had multi-auras there for a little bit. Teleport directly on top of the really dangerous ones, or the ones with the auras, though, if you can. Or just make sure you slink around on the outside if there's not a lot of rangers. Make sure you don't jump right into it. you could take more damage than you might be bargaining for, and that's especially the case if you're not curse immune or you're lacking DR or defense or a combination of all those stats. So you see here, this boss is always a lot of fun, but look how much we leech. That's really a good demo of how much we're leeching there. He literally can't kill us as long as we stay on top of him. It's actually great.
I can't carry anymore.
It's pretty impressive stuff. Well, at any rate, that River of Blood is insanely easy. It's a very good map, insanely good stuff. And you can see there that you can definitely get a ton of experience as well, even if you're lacking it. So, great stuff indeed. Look at that, we even found a Raven Frost on our journeys. Very cool. Even found a Earth Shifter. Wow. Okay. Well, at any rate, I think you guys are pretty convinced that's the end of the guide here. He's an S tier beast this season. I consider him one of the strongest mappers in the game. As a matter of fact, I put him as the 3rd strongest with maxed out gear. Yeah, I mean, he's pretty nuts. This is a pretty nutty weapon. You don't need anything quite this powerful though, especially for LOD content or weaker maps, but even for stronger maps. That being said, once you get something like this or a crazy steel pillar even, and other crazy items that I described earlier, such as Overlord's Helm even, you can absolutely shred the game with a Whirlwind Barbarian. Of course, this is part of the two-handed hardcore series, so I like to emphasize at the end, don't be afraid to try a build without a shield. On hardcore, you just have to build it correctly, and you have to play it correctly. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, if you have a build with summons, just utilize the summons and make sure they don't die as I described on the Druid. If you have energy shield, you know, you can even have DR or curse immunity or not. Just make sure you have a ton of health and keep the energy shield up and be mindful of it. And with that plus sustain, you'll also be able to keep yourself alive very effectively as well. So yeah, there's a lot of, you know, good options and whatnot, but this build leeches like crazy. He is really hard to kill just in general. He's a beast. So yeah, definitely try out a Whirlwind Barbarian. He's almost never been stronger than ever. He has incurred maybe some nerfs in the recent past, but definitely nothing that's going to hurt this build very significantly. He's a monster. But anyway, yeah, check out the rest of my guides here for PD2 and D2R. And of course, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And yeah, make sure to subscribe if you want more content and things of that nature. Also check out my D2R guides on Maxwell. And of course, check out the Season 6 tier list, comprehensive tier list and infographic. We have a video for that on YouTube, and of course you could type exclamation tier list into my channel. Anyway, I stream Diablo 2, typically 6 to 7 days a week, at twitch.tv/Dark Humility. We'll even be doing a Slamfest 6.0 here this Saturday, 10 a.m. PT, so you can check that out as well. Anyway, guys, let's get it. Check out the timestamps below if you want to check out any part of this guide. Hope you guys liked what you saw. He is a monster, indeed. Dark Humility, over and out. See you guys next time.